Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see that we've still got some people filtering in, but it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And just want to say thank you again for all of you joining us today and being here as we continue doing these market update webinars on a weekly basis, so that we can all keep up with what's going on. And we're here to help you make informed decisions during this time. So we're glad to be able to continue to offer these. If you do have a question for our speaker, if you'll drop it into the Q&A box or the chat box that should be on your screen there, he'll be happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. So drop those in there, and then we'll do that at the end. If you missed any of our webinars earlier this week, we've had a variety of stuff going on this week. We did our Ranching 101 program on Tuesday on soil health. On Wednesday, we released one of our School for Successful Ranching sessions, which was a calving demonstration. And if you're interested in any of those recordings or files, just shoot us an email, reply to your confirmation for the webinar at registration@tscra.org, and we'd be happy to get that for you. We are recording today's session as well, and it will go out tomorrow. The recording will go out to each of you tomorrow, so be sure and look for that. We're putting out our next School for Successful Ranching session next Tuesday. It's going to be titled, "Hey Doc, I've got a dead cow, now what?" And so we're going to talk about, if you do find a dead cow, what processes you should go through. And I think that's going to be a really interesting one. We are presenting some of those School for Successful Ranching presentations that were going to be done during our convention that was supposed to be at the end of March that we were not able to host. But our speakers have done a phenomenal job, and I want to comment and just compliment our speakers on making this pivot to virtual presentations. We're used to a lot of face-to-face stuff, and so it's been really fun to learn something new and to learn kind of that you do have an interest in some of this online stuff. So we're excited. And that one will be on Tuesday. Go check out our website, and we'll have all that information up there. But with nothing else I have to say, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Very glad to have him today, and again, also making the pivot to this online stuff and getting us very timely information. I know it is making a difference. So we've got Dr. Justin Benavides. He's an assistant professor and AgriLife Extension economist in Amarillo. He received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in agricultural economics at Texas A&M University, where he focused on livestock economics and agricultural policy. Justin conducts research and programming in economic topics including livestock, row crops, water, marketing, and policy, and he publishes a weekly blog called Amarillo Ag Econ. So I'm really excited to have you here today. I think this is your first program for cattle raisers, and so we'll be sure and add you to the speaker lineup moving forward. But appreciate you being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Uh-oh, I think we lost you.
Oh, I unmuted it. Are you,
okay?
Can you hear me? Yes, it's all yours now.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you all for having me. Hope that I can lend some insight today that maybe you haven't heard. I know we're going to, at the end, cover a little bit about the packing situation up here in the High Plains. I'm in Amarillo, so have kind of an ear to the ground on what's going on in the feeder and the packer industry. And so we'll just go ahead and dive on in. I want to start by saying I know I am an economist, but I used to be a person. So before I got all of this fundamental analysis under my belt, I grew up on a cow-calf ranch here in Tulia, in Tulia, just outside of Amarillo. And so I know kind of what we're all facing, and I still have friends that are raising cattle alongside many of you. So I understand and get comments every day about the challenges we're facing. So I'm always here to listen or help with anything I can. So I'll put up my contact information at the end, and willing to talk about whatever I can. If I don't know the answer, I'll find someone who does. So we'll go ahead and dive on in. So we're going to go over a little bit of a roadmap of how we got here. So we'll talk about, I think we've all been beat to death by now with information on COVID-19. So I'm really not going to talk about particularly COVID-19, but maybe a little bit of the market forces that preceded the outbreak, and then some of the market information that has followed the outbreak and the fundamentals of why we are where we are now. We'll talk a little bit about where we're headed in terms of maybe where the next week and then maybe the next 12 months, where the markets are headed. And then I'll put up some resources at the end to provide a little bit more after this presentation if you're interested in reading on a bit more, or maybe some programming that AgriLife Extension has coming up in the near future. So we'll just start with how we got here. So when this, I think, became real for a lot of us, when the outbreak and the disease being present in the United States became real for a lot of us, I know here in my world, it really became present kind of the day the NBA canceled, mostly because that was the first major cancellation. I'm not really a big follower of basketball. If any of you know where Tulia is and know anything about Nazareth, Texas, it's right down the road. So Tulia was never very good at basketball in comparison to some of the people that are surrounding us. But it was the first major cancellation of any sort of sports or major event that kind of hit the news in a real way. And so I kind of think of that as the real beginning of the outbreak and sort of the economic downturn for the United States and Texas as well. And so other events followed suit quickly. You know, we saw NHL close, we saw MLB cancel spring training and eventually the season. And that's important for a lot of reasons, but for us, it matters because we consume a lot of food at these events, and we'll get more into how that's impacted the markets directly a little bit later. But as events and restaurants closed, or a lot of them scaled back on how they were delivering food, we had a major shift in consumption. And again, we'll talk a little bit about where we were before the outbreak in a second, but basically the outbreak itself shifted consumption from consuming food in restaurants and in larger scale venues to most of us are eating at home now. I know most places in Amarillo are still offering either a drive up or drive through option, but I know in certain places, you know, smaller restaurants have had to close and aren't even able to offer that. So most of the offerings are even scaled back. So I know certain places, McDonald's has limited its menu just to make the ease of people going through the restaurant drive up a little bit easier. And so we've seen just a shift in the demand for different cuts. And we'll talk about how that's impacting the market as well. Just some general market trends. We don't have a good figure on exactly what unemployment is. I know a lot of times people that I interact with just assume that what the published number is from the federal government is the exact situation. And the reality is there's a lot of gray area in the way that data is reported, the number of people who have chosen to go in and file for unemployment. All of that presents a big gray area, but estimations right now have total unemployment in the U.S. somewhere between 15 and 20%, which is higher than the peak from the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis. So this has been a very swift and severe decline in overall availability of spending. And that's not just going to be on our durable goods or, you know, spending on things that we don't really need. It's also going to change the way we spend money on food. And that's really important for us in the cattle industry. Right now, as much as I know I've seen a lot in social media and discussions I've had with other producers of a sort of frustration with the packer. Right now, the packers' capacity and their ability to remain open is a choke point for the industry, and every processing plant that is slowed down or closed is really going to have a big impact on prices in the near term. And really what's slowing down the market right now, even more than an individual closure, is the overall trend of lower line speeds. And so as workers are spaced out and we have to take more stringent precautions for worker safety within a plant, that just slows the line down. And I think eventually, even with these safety precautions in place, we'll at least speed back up. But as long as this disease is a risk, we're going to see slower line speeds. And so that will be a long-term impact for our industry further than a month out. I mean, until we have a vaccine or some widely available treatment, our workers are going to be operating under less than optimal conditions as far as speed and efficiency in our packing plants. So what we're going to go over now is how do all of our prices adjust to those signals. That's what the rest of this little presentation will be on. So just a kind of an overview again, we already talked about sort of unemployment, but this was the map of real GDP growth from the International Monetary Fund prior to the outbreak of COVID-19 and the coronavirus worldwide. What you see here is a graphic of percent change in GDP year over year, and GDP is the best measure we have of output in a certain economy. So the red line is emerging markets and developing economies. The blue line is advanced economies. And when we say advanced economies, we typically think of our G8 countries, so things like the United States, Great Britain, Japan, and emerging markets and developing economies are more what we would call our BRIC countries. So BRIC stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then there's also a lot of Southeastern Asian countries that make up that red line as well. The red line is particularly important for us in the ag industry because about 50% of the world's population is represented within that red line as far as the economies. So any movement in that red line is going to have a huge impact on spending on food as well as other products. And so 1% increase in disposable income in those red line countries is really going to have a huge impact comparatively when we consider, our advanced economies. And then you have in green an aggregate of all the world's economies. And in the kind of gray box out here, I don't know if y'all can see my mouse, but the gray shaded box, that's a forecast from the end of 2019 through 2024. And again, this was all prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus. And so now what I've included is the black line is going to show us where worldwide GDP growth is expected for the next forecasted period, which again is through 2024. And so you can see what the IMF is predicting is a sharp decrease in overall GDP growth. So worldwide GDP is forecast to be down around 3%, and it's much more severe for our advanced economies. So the United States is forecast to have a GDP change of negative 5.9% into the next year, and overall advanced economies are forecast down with a loss of 6.1%. There's going to be losses in our emerging economies as well, but it's going to be particularly severe in our advanced economies. Now, that being said, the shape of that curve shows you that it's expected to be a very short and sharp recession, so we should climb out of this relatively quickly. The hope is that we continue to see growth beyond the end of the recession that kind of flattens out and gives us a more upward trajectory. We already had kind of flattened out there towards the end of the teens. There was some movement up and down, but overall the trend of GDP growth was down. And so the more money that people have, the more they're willing to spend on more expensive cuts of meat. The more money that an emerging economy has, the more they shift to protein. So GDP growth and overall economic stability is really important for our industry. So now again, talking a little bit about the fundamentals of how we got where we are, even before the outbreak of the coronavirus. We were at the peak of the cattle cycle, and so it's a really smooth cattle cycle this time. If you look at this trend all the way back into the 80s and the 70s, we had very sharp increases in herd size and then very sharp decreases in herd size, and we've kind of flattened that trend out. And so what you can see here is in 2019 and into 2020, we reached the peak of the cattle cycle. And so we had the largest cow herd we've had in a while, and that was depressing prices already. You look at the number of cows is directly correlated to the number of calves that we're going to have on feed the next year. And so that then results in the amount of beef we'll have shortly after the cattle are finished. And so a higher number of cows means that we're going to have a larger amount of beef. And if you've ever heard me present before, you know that I'll say the fundamental forces of economics are that an increase in supply with any sort of stability and demand means we're going to have lower prices. And you can complicate that relationship in a lot of different ways. But the general fundamental picture for the most recent year was that we had a huge amount of beef in supply, as well as a huge amount of pork and chicken. So our overall meat complex was flooded with protein in the last year. And so that is just going to overall depress the price that we're going to see for those products. Now, moving into 2020, we had seen the first decrease in the number of cows that we were going to have on record for about 5 or 6 years. So that was going to be, support an upward movement in prices prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus. But even that was not going to be seen until Q4 and maybe into 2021, because as we wait for that smaller number of cows to have a smaller number of calves, which equates to a smaller amount of beef, that takes time. And that's just the nature of the biological lagging of our industry. And so overall, we were at a point of pretty low prices in general, and that's been really complicated by the impacts of the coronavirus. So I just got the opportunity to look at the cattle on feed report, and I don't do math in my head very well, but placements for this month were down somewhere between 20 and 30%. And so that is just a result of low prices not really being attractive enough for many of us to send our cattle to be placed on feed. And so I know just anecdotally here in the high plains between Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas, placements are down about 20% on the nose, but nationwide we're down somewhere between 20 to 30% as far as cattle placed on feed leading up to the month of April. And so you can see that for the last 5 years preceding 2019, we had a lower number of cattle on feed. Within 2019, the number of cattle on feed had increased kind of to where its peak was, but we were still going to have a large number of cattle on feed at the beginning of January and February. And the more animals that are fed out, again, the higher the amount of beef, and more beef with a stable demand means that we're going to see a lower price. And again, this is just another signal telling us we were going to have pressure on prices at least through, the end of the third quarter and maybe even into the fourth quarter. But this whole situation has been complicated now because as prices are not incentivizing people to move their animals to be placed on feed, we're going to see for the first time a decrease in the number of cattle on feed. We broke nearly every record for the cattle on feed report as far as monthly comparisons last year. This will be the first time in about 12 or 16 months that we have dipped below the previous year. And in fact, we've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of, it looks like around 1.5, maybe 0.75 million head, so quite a few animals less placed on feed this year for the month of March into April. And so that's going to have a significant impact as we look at sizes going forward, and therefore, again, market impacts on the amount of beef available in the line going forward. Another issue we had been facing is that steer dressed weights were high, and so a larger number of calves along with a larger size is just going to equate to more beef in the pipeline. Again, the higher the amount of beef, with stable demand, we're going to expect to see a lower price. And so in general, overall, our trend was just showing us already headed towards a low price environment for the first half of this year. Originally, prior to the outbreak, we were expecting a higher price setting in the end of Q3, beginning of Q4. It's easy to predict direction. It's hard to predict timing and magnitude, but fundamental forces told us that we were going to have a higher price towards the end of this year. And because of the volatility in this market, we really just don't know. And asking us to predict price right now, we can give you an outlook for what we expect price to be, and the only guarantee is it's going to be wrong, at least by some amount. The fact of the matter is, because of the volatility and worker safety in packing plants, any sort of shutdown or slowdown, again, could really change our forecasts for the next couple of months. And so overall, again, expecting a low price environment where we were leading up to at the beginning of this year. And again, additional pressure has been placed on us by the coronavirus. And so now we'll talk a little bit about where we've moved into now that the virus is a part of our everyday reality. So because we are seeing some of these complications in the availability of packer capacity, we're going to have some weird changes in the amount of beef that is demanded or supplied and the number of cattle that are demanded as far as going forward. And so what we're going to look at next is cattle slaughter into the beginning of the coronavirus. And so again, you can see right here, somewhere around uh, middle of March. So again, I like to think of March 12th as kind of the beginning of this becoming reality in the United States. We saw a spike in the number of cattle slaughtered on a weekly basis. And that was in response to those original rushes to the grocery store that we all saw. So that was as people were demanding more beef, we were seeing the processor and the grocer trying to take advantage of that demand. And so as they were putting more animals through, overall cattle slaughtered on a weekly basis increased. And so then we saw it peak about 3 weeks ago, maybe that's around 4 weeks ago. And what's happening now is the reality of this virus is beginning to impact our overall packing capacity as we see plants like Greeley close down, and as we see it become, a fact of keeping workers separate and slowing down the lines a little bit to increase worker safety. That just leads us to an ability to process fewer animals. You can see from such a high level of over 675,000 head processed, we've now dipped down to around 500,000 head processed. And so what that means is that we're going to have a lot of volatility in prices, and that'll be shown in the feeder cattle slides as we get towards the end with prices. But what we're seeing now is that as overall production is sliding, so cattle slaughter is decreasing, that's a result of our limited packer capacity. And so even though we have stable beef demand on the output side, demanding more beef, the ability to process more cattle has basically been eliminated. And so that basically kind of leads us to the situation that we faced with oil last week, or at the beginning of this week, excuse me. As these lines have slowed down, each additional animal showing up to the packing plant has basically become worth less and less, because if a packer can't process an animal, it essentially has no value to that business. And so the demand for fed cattle has decreased. And as we see a demand decrease with stable supply, we're going to see that opposite effect I was talking about earlier, which is going to be a decrease in price. And so this kink in the market is leading to those weird dynamics we're seeing where, although beef price and record cutouts are occurring, we're seeing a lower price for feeder cattle over on the back end. And so again, you see the same pattern with beef production directly correlated to the number of cattle being slaughtered. We saw a run up in the overall amount of beef produced as packers were trying to take advantage of those people that were trying to consume more meat, trying to stock up on more meat, and as grocers were taking advantage of that situation as well, or at least trying to just supply enough for the people that were showing up. I know I faced empty shelves on my stores here in Amarillo, and we're surrounded by cattle, so that's a really interesting dynamic to think about. But as grocers and packers tried to at least supply the demand that was there, the beef demand was increasing, but their capacity was still at the same as it was before. And so again, that led us to a point where even though we were seeing a record amount of beef demand in a short period of time, their ability to process anymore had decreased. And so these weird volatility figures are what are leading us to some of the decreases in prices that we're seeing. And a lot of what I have to remind people of is that people trade the rumor, they sell the rumor, buy the rumor and sell the fact. And so early on, people were buying up the available meat because the rumor was we were going to run out and there was going to be a shortage of available protein as well as other foodstuffs. And the reality is now, at least here on the High Plains, and as more and more of these packers have faced slowdowns in lines, we're only now beginning to see those shortages. So early on, there was an excess of demand, and now we're seeing the demand forces shift, and we're actually being driven by supply forces in this market now. So we've been kind of facing challenges both from the demand and now from the supply side, and that's really complicating the market, our ability to forecast as well as an ability to make a profit. It's hard to know when to market your animals when price changes are basically changing direction every single week. Now, I've heard several people when I've had these discussions tell me, well, we've got a lot of, cold storage. We had a very large number on a cold storage report, and that is true. We did have as far as the report is concerned, and compared to older versions of the cold storage report, we had a large amount beef and other proteins in cold storage. But put in perspective, 510 approximately million pounds of beef in cold storage, that's only enough for every person in the US to have about 1.5 pounds of beef. So in reality, that doesn't leave us with just an excess amount of beef in cold storage. And overall, if you look at red meat and poultry, we only have about 7 pounds of meat, red meat and poultry, available in cold storage for each person living in the United States, for 330 million people. And so while people, sometimes we consider cold storage as an ability to moderate supply and demand, it's not really designed to function that way. The cold storage report is basically documenting our on-time delivery system. And so because our entire grocery industry and our food industry is developed to deliver food as fresh as possible and as quickly as possible, this cold storage report basically just documents our cold storage staging. So we don't have just a ton left that gives us an ability to moderate supply and demand very well. So that's just something to keep in mind. We do have beef in cold storage, but it's not a lot when you consider the number of people we have to feed in the United States. So I'm going to go show a slide that I think I'm showing because I'm digital, and I know that I would be looking for a door somewhere nearby if I was presenting this to a lot of you in person. But we had a record boxed beef cutout value over this last week. I know the daily hit 282 the last time I checked. Now the weekly average is not going to be that high, but again, what this is a result of is the fact that, again, grocers are starting to buy the rumor because they are seeing that more than one plant is facing a slowdown, and at least one plant was closed. I was told today Greeley is reopening as of today, but there are risks to some of our other plants that we'll talk about, here coming up. And so grocers, again, are beginning to buy the rumor. Now, the packers don't have the ability necessarily to increase their capacity because of these new health restrictions, some of which have been placed by their county health agencies. So their ability to take in more cattle has been limited, while the demand for beef from the grocer has skyrocketed because they're beginning to fear a lack of supply in the near future. And that's what's leading to this increased boxed beef cutout, and something that I know has been challenging for a lot of us to watch. We'll talk a little bit about specific cuts now. I'm sure a lot of you, being well-versed in the cattle and the beef industry, know a lot of this, but as I said earlier, what's changing too is not only the amount that we're consuming, but also the type of meats that we're consuming. And so overall, if you look at the beef ribeye, so the ribeye primal, this is typically something that we consume at a restaurant. I know I typically like to think that I can cook a pretty good steak, but a lot of times people are consuming their beef, these higher value cuts in a restaurant setting. And so we're seeing that price fall as a result of lower restaurant demand. But in other stuff, let's say looking at chuck, where you get more of your roasts, and in some cases we're even beginning to grind these chucks, we're seeing a spike in price because more and more of us are consuming these roasts at home, cubed beef for stews at home, ground meat at home. And so as the demand for these typically lower value cuts increases with, again, a stable supply, we're seeing the price skyrocket. And this is going to be a reality for a lot of us for a while. Again, if you think back to that GDP graph that I showed earlier, we're facing a recession. And so recessionary spending is different than expansionary spending. And so as people have less income, they're going to deviate to cheaper cuts. They're going to consume more food at home. We're going to see more consumption of ground beef, more consumption of these chucks, and a lower amount of consumption of steaks and those other primals you typically consume in a restaurant. So again, looking at another cut that we would typically consider a lower value cut, though this is that boneless beef price, so fresh lean. So a lot of this is, from trimmings. We saw a decrease in the value of this cut as we moved into the beginning of the pandemic. We were just following some fundamentals on that section that were leading us to a lower value. But as soon as the coronavirus hit, and again, if you look, it was mid-March when that began to become a reality for us in the United States, the price of basically what's contributing to ground beef skyrocketed. It went back up. And again, if you'll look at the 50% lean, that has also begun to go up recently because people are consuming a lot more at home, which means a lot more ground beef is being consumed at home. It's a lot more hamburger helper. That's a lot more beef patties at home. And what that leads us to is a situation where the demand for lean has skyrocketed while the supply of lean has not changed all that much. This is contributing, if you watch the Choice Select spread as far as cutouts, this is contributing to that shrinking Choice Select spread. So we're not seeing the price of Choice decrease all that much. What we're seeing is more of a increase in the price for Selects. And so as these trimmings become more valuable for their input into the ground beef system, the price for Select meat is going to be a little bit more valuable because we need more ground beef, because more and more people are demanding ground beef. And it was really interesting. Again, I haven't been to the grocery store today, but last week when I went, there wasn't ground beef to be found anywhere in the grocery store, but there was plenty of steaks. There were several briskets still in the case. So I just find that, very indicative of where we're headed into the next year or two. So all of this meat pricing then feeds back into the price for fed steers. And you can see as we were following that trend of lower prices because of increased supplies, we hit the bottom about mid-March. The price for feeder steers began to climb as we saw a demand for for more calves to be processed. And so if you were to think back to those graphs I was showing earlier, an increased demand for meat and increased slaughter means that we needed more steers, and a higher demand with a stable supply means we're going to have an increase in the price for slaughter steers or fed steers, what we'd say fats. And so then what we hit was this slowdown in the ability to process enough animals. And so we have the same amount of steers that we had a month ago that were available to be processed. But now what we're facing again is that limited packer capacity. So as we've slowed down the line, sometimes 25, sometimes 50%, and certain plants have closed, the demand for slaughter steers has gone down in the Southern Plains. And that is leading to a lower price for fed steers, out in the general market. So that again then feeds back into our demand for calves and for feeder steers. And so as we look at this chart, we can see again, we were following basic market fundamentals. And then as the reality of packing capacity began to hit, we saw a rundown in price that was kind of tied to general market skittiness, some trepidation about the future of the market. So if you look at the correlation between these first dips in the price for cattle, you're going to see a lot of that is some investor sentiment. So probably some money that was on funds more out of traders on Wall Street necessarily than it was on actual market fundamentals. As people were pulling their money out of commodities and out of equities, they were putting it into treasuries or bonds. We saw a lot of that money leave because of just economic insecurity. And then we saw a rally in those prices for a short period of time that was a result of the increased demand for beef. And now again, on this back end, we're beginning to face a decrease in price because of the limited packer capacity. And even though we have an incredible amount of demand for meat, we just don't have the capacity to process more cattle. And so that price has bled through all the way back from slaughter steers down to our calves and again, our feeders. So same market fundamentals here that we're facing in the 500 to 600 pounders. We're seeing in the 700 to 800 pounders. Market skittiness here at the beginning where money was leaving commodities, and again, that increase in value towards the end of April. And now we're facing packer capacity again. So I want to touch briefly. I've talked a lot about packer capacity. What I want to talk about here is the situation where I am in the High Plains. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this map that's popped up around on social media recently. It's a map of all of the packers that are in the United States for both beef and pork and their status at the moment, so whether they're open or closed. So a steer means that they're open, an X means that they're closed. You can see that we've got 4 plants here in the High Plains, kind of within the area that I cover in my role. That's in Friona, Dumas, Amarillo. The plant in Hereford is Cavaness, so that's going to be your cow packer. So the three large ones that we kind of were paying attention to, are JBS and Dumas, Tyson here in Amarillo, and then Cargill and Friona. Combined, they're responsible for about 15,000 head per day in a normal situation. So that's a large amount of packing capacity within a very small area. Most of them are running at around 50 to 75% capacity at the moment. Again, slower lines because of the need to keep workers apart from each other to maintain safety and slow the spread of COVID-19. The major concern that I have at the moment that has become very present for us in the High Plains as of the last basically 48 hours is that Dumas is currently ranked as the 14th highest positive COVID-19 test per capita in the country. So that's a big risk to that plant. And a lot of those positive cases are tied to the JBS plant because it's a large place for people to congregate and then return home. Now, I haven't heard of a lot of actual severe illnesses yet, but most of my evidence is anecdotal, so I can't speak to the reality of it. But again, what we're looking at here on the High Plains, this is our daily new cases of COVID-19 in the Texas High Plains. And the most recent bar that you see here is new cases as of 2 days ago. So we're behind a lot of the rest of the country on the High Plains just because we're more rural. People weren't visiting here at the beginning of the outbreak. And so we contracted the virus a little bit later than the rest of the country, even though we were already closing down. And so now we're seeing the peak of the virus, or at least a very swift ramp up in cases of the virus right now, which is a major concern because if any of these plants close, we're going to lose around 5,000 head a day in packing capacity. So Greeley reopened today, which is really beneficial for prices, and I think we could see some upward pressure on prices in the next week. But if we're risking another one of these plants in the near future, that could be very detrimental to the overall cattle and beef complex. And I hope that doesn't happen. It's just the reality of the situation, and as unpleasant as it is to talk about, it's something that we have to consider and prepare for going forward. So I think this could be, the Greeley plant opening could be beneficial, but if we lose another plant, pressure on prices in the High Plains and Texas in particular could be under a lot of pressure. So it'll be really key to watch what's happening in Dumas and what happens in the surrounding communities. I've heard a lot of talk from places as far north as Dalhart and as far south as here in Amarillo and Canyon, where people are starting to come here for their daily needs rather than spending time in Dumas just because of the spike in cases that they're facing in Dumas at the moment. So as a quick wrap up, right now we're facing a lot of volatility that's very difficult to prepare for, and I know that's challenging. We're still preparing ourselves and figuring out ways to, prepare ourselves for the new market realities, but the market fundamentals are going to change. We're going to see a backup in processing, which is going to lead us to heavier weights. And as we see heavier weights, those cattle become more inefficient. Even back at the cow-calf level, the longer that you are holding on to those animals, the lower the efficiency is, the more that you're feeding those animals to achieve a pound of gain as they grow. And so we're having to readjust the way that we're addressing this market, and we're working on ways at AgriLife to prepare market strategies for all of you into the near future. I expect lower prices through Q3, potentially Q4. A lot of that's going to depend on how fast our economic recovery is. I certainly hope that we see a fast uptick once jobs reopen, and I know a lot of states are considering reopening at the moment. So any ability to increase income is going to be very beneficial for the beef and cattle complex. But until we see an economic recovery, I have a lot of concern for prices, and that could bleed into 2021 easily. Currently, we're waiting on CFAP payment calculations. I know last Friday, Secretary Perdue announced that there were going to be payments and that the losses were going to be addressed differently between January and April than they are from April going forward. And I've seen formulas posted out there. I'm a little bit hesitant to provide you all with a formula because it hasn't been confirmed by USDA to my knowledge. And additionally, even the formula that's out there, the prices that they're talking about have not been set. So we don't know what cash price they're going to follow or if they're going to follow a futures price. And so I'm hesitant to give you a formula to start preparing for. What I can tell you is that if it has anything that is similar to the PPP programs, the small business programs, the most important thing is going to be to be prepared early. So get your documentation in place, get your losses in place, have your financials put together, have your inventory put together so that you can be one of the first ones into the office to start talking about your disaster payments. Because if the money runs out and they're doing it they choose to do it on a first come, first served basis, if you're one of the last ones in the office, you might be facing an even worse hardship than those around you. What we're thinking about going forward, feed costs are going to be down. So this hasn't just hit the beef market or the cattle market. Obviously, it's hit all other markets. So the dynamics of the feed industry are going to be changing. All 4 of our plants for ethanol in the High Plains are either closed or operating at 50 to 25% of total capacity. We're going to have a lower availability of DDGs, but that means we're going to have more corn available. So if any of you are interested in the ability to maybe retain ownership and see if you can retain some profits that way, that's something to consider. Fuel costs are down as well. I'm sure you all saw negative oil prices on Monday. If you have the ability to store on-farm fuel or maybe hedge some of your inputs into the upcoming year, this is a time to be considering that. If you're on a pasture system where you have improved pasture, but primarily we're thinking about, East Texas, where you fertilize and really put a lot of work and investment into your managed pasture, you might think about looking at fertilizer prices right now. We've had a spike in fertilizer price. Coincidentally, the phosphorus that we use is mined in Wuhan, the province where this originally broke out. But we could see a spike in fertilizer prices if you haven't already faced that. So thinking about ways to, limit your costs going forward is really kind of going to be the name of the game, and approaching some different marketing strategies than we've seen before. This is definitely a year to be flexible. Spend some time with your accountant, spend some time with your local extension specialist, with your TSCRA representatives. Think about ways that you can market a little bit differently or save some costs. Look for some value-added opportunities, maybe some value-added programs, even some local marketing options. I mean, any way that you can increase your revenues a little bit by spending a little bit more time on your marketing is going to be key, because we can't influence the external forces impacting our market, but we can impact the way that we react to them. And so that's what we got to kind of focus on into the next year. A couple of resources coming up here in the near future. I talked about a little bit of decision-making we all are facing, so marketing options as well as cost-cutting options. This website at the top, agecoextension.tamu.edu, with the decision aids and the beef at the back, has a host of decision aids that you can look into. So you can evaluate that retained ownership option. You can evaluate some different reproductive options. You can evaluate different input options as well. There are dozens of different spreadsheets there that you can go use to evaluate your opportunities in the upcoming year. Again, as Stacy said at the beginning, I write a weekly blog called Amarillo Ag Econ. You can just Google that and it'll be the first link that comes up. Today we're going to be talking about what happened and why there's negative oil prices, how that is possible, and what led into the environment for negative oil prices. In reality, I talk about a lot of different things. Last year was a lot of trade and a lot of different hemp stuff, because hemp became a popular topic on the High Plains. This upcoming year, I see myself talking a lot more about ways to cut costs and a lot of ways to increase your marketing dollar, just because I think that's going to be important for us in the upcoming year. Additionally, AgriLife is putting on a 6-part online beef management economics series through the month of May. So that'll start, I think we're already at May next week. It feels like every week is its own year, but I think this begins next week. And if it's not next week, it's the next week. And so you can register for $10 a person. It's $10 whether you listen to one session or $10 whether you listen to all 6 sessions. And so we'll be doing that in the evenings from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So it'll basically have some of our animal science professionals discussing a management option, some opportunities for you to take advantage of. And then myself and Dr. David Anderson, who's our state livestock economist with Extension, will be talking about the economics of those decisions. So does it pay to have a breeding soundness exam done beforehand? What are the costs and benefits of those decisions? A host of different management decisions will be covered, but we'd be happy for all of you to join us. Again, it's $10, and it'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 hours of programming total. So you can listen to one session or all 6 for just $10. And I hope that some of you are able to join us. This is my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions. Some of your TSCRA reps, I'm sure, have my cell phone. I'll give it to them if they don't. I'm happy. We're not in the office right now, but I'm happy to take calls on my cell. And you can email me anytime. I'm happy to help with whatever I can. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions. Stacy, do you have anything for me?
Yes. So we had one come through on the question and answer. And just a reminder, if you do want to ask a question, type those into the question and answer box or the chat box. So the first one is realizing it's still early in the game and no one can know for sure. Given the anemic cow-calf returns the past couple of years, average producer age, and now COVID-19, do you believe we could see significant producer attrition?
So banking and finance liquidity is not really my specialty. I'm more of a livestock economist, but conversations I've been having, I think we're going to see some people exit the industry, whether that's on the farming side or whether it's on the livestock side. Now, I can't speak to the age of the people that choose to exit, but if you were already facing retirement and right now you're having to suffer through these low prices, if you had money saved up for retirement where it was possible for you to exit, I don't really see how this is not going to encourage, maybe not encourage, but force some of our older producers to think about their long-term decisions as far as retiring or remaining in the industry. To be sure, we're all facing these challenges at the same time, but I don't know so much about age as it's going to be our people who have a limited access to liquidity. They're going to be facing challenges. We're going to be seeing people. I have concerns about land values going forward as our lower commodity prices are bid into our land values. You know, we could see a lack of access to capital. So those people who are over leveraged and already in a rough financial situation, I have more concern about that than I have about the age of our producers. In certain cases, I know some of our older producers have been able to, work themselves out of debt. And so this is another market fluctuation for some of our older, more experienced producers who are going to be able to ride this out. So I have more concern about our financially challenged producers than I do for our more senior producers.
Okay, thank you. We had one come in.
Anything else?
Yes. We had one come in the chat box for the small to medium-sized ranchers.
Okay.
Are you not hearing me? Oh. Well, he may have. Well, everyone, we may have just lost Justin. We'll see if he can jump back. There you are.
Okay. Did y'all lose me or did I lose you?
I'm not sure. We may have all lost each other. So I think we're, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Okay. So that's good. So we do have another question that came through on the chat. For the small to medium-sized ranchers who usually sell through local auction houses to grower stockyards, does it make sense to keep the calves, cut the bulls ourselves, and hold on until prices come up?
As far as holding on, I've heard a lot of people evaluate that as a strategy. The fundamental forces say that we're not going to have a price spike or a really high increase in prices, a sustained increase in price for the near term. So if your decision is based more on short term, can I squeeze out a little bit more profit, then that might be worth holding on. Putting more costs into those calves on a pasture basis and not considering maybe retained ownership through the feed yard, you're going to be, on the brief runs that I've done for the models up here in the high plains, you're probably going to be losing money if you just hold on and wait for a higher price, because we're not really seeing any sort of signals telling us a higher price is coming any sooner than early winter or very late fall. And so the challenge is that our feed yards are just backed up because of the backup in the packing industry. So I would wait and maybe see if the weekly price is going to give you slightly higher returns than the previous weekly price. But as far as waiting for a higher price to eventually net you a profit, I'm just not sure we're going to see that in time for the costs, the inputs on that calf to eventually pay off in the long term.
Okay, great. We've got another one here. In our U.S. feed beef is our U.S. feed beef industry making any progress on using the Canadian model of pulling some of the on-feed inventory back to a maintenance ration to help spread out the snowball of harvest numbers for the next 2 to 3 months? Also, are there discussions moving forward on getting some form of payment from the government to cover some of the cost of this strategy?
So I had those conversations. We have a very good extension beef specialist here in Amarillo. His name is Dr. Jason Smith. And I've been having some of those conversations with him as of recently as this morning, wondering, is there a way that we can really slow down the speed of which our animals are gaining weight? And the challenge is making sure that we're not sacrificing cost efficiency to attain those slowdowns. And so in reality, I don't know if we're making progress on that, but I know people are giving thought to how do we slow down the overall increases in weight, which should hopefully temper some of this glut of supply of live animals that we have that feeds into the amount of beef we have on the back end. I don't know about progress towards the Canadian model explicitly, but people are giving considerations to how to slow this overall growth. But the reality is we're going to be seeing calves packed at over 1,600 pounds by the time this all shakes out. There's just no way to get around the continued growth. You can have animals on a maintenance ration, but eventually you're going to continue to lose funds that way. So we're just going to see larger cattle processed as we go forward. And I don't see a real way around that without some really unique strategies. And even on a unique strategy, it's going to be a case-to-case basis, not only depending on the yard, but depending on the pen within the yard, in my mind.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, does anybody else have any questions they want to send through? So can we keep cattle on pasture?
Can we keep cattle on pasture?
Mm-hmm. That's all it says. So I don't know if I can follow up to.
So, we can continue to keep calves on pasture. I would encourage you to evaluate your costs. I would encourage you to think long and hard about what you think that calf is going to be worth at the end. If we have enough of a capacity increase, we're still going to have a demand for protein. But it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. You can definitely evaluate those decisions yourself, but depending on how much pasture you have available, that's one kind of caveat to all of this, is we've had decent pasture available on the high plains. I know some people around the state are facing drought, but if you've got free grass right now, then that changes my answer to hold on, wait for a slightly higher price. But we all know that rains come a little bit more infrequently and sporadically in the summer. So it would still behoove you to think about, are you going to market these animals before we see summer heat? But yeah, if you've got free grass, then waiting until you see the most near-term high price wouldn't hurt.
Okay. So we do have a question that's come into the chat, and I have opened up. So we do have Caleb McLaurin on the call, who is our Executive Director of Government and Public Affairs. And we've got a question that I think he's going to help us address. So Caleb, can you hear us? Can you tell us?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Okay, perfect. Let me read you this, and then we'll go from there. COVID or no COVID, the packers have always put it to the beef producers. The cash price disparity has increased during this pandemic crisis. What avenue would you suggest government intervention or otherwise, that would create a level playing field for the beef producers? Also, do you perceive any substantial financial governmental assistance for the beef producer? Again, this was a comment and question that came in on our chat.
Yeah, well, and thank y'all for that. I guess maybe I'll address it in two parts, and I'll start kind of at the end in regards to the governmental financial assistance that was mentioned. In a best way to put this briefly, I guess, many of y'all may have seen that the CARES Act passed Congress about 3 or so weeks ago. With that was a substantial amount of money that was earmarked for agriculture. Specifically, there was a pile of money, I think it was $9.5 billion earmarked for beef cattle, dairy cattle, and some specialty crops. And all of those monies were sent over to USDA. At the same time, as part of that CARES Act, they expanded agriculture's ability to go for small business administrative loans at the SBA, which historically agricultural producers could not access. And so if you're looking for some sort of immediate relief, that's what is available today. And that comes in two forms. One is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. Some of y'all might have seen that in the news. And what that does is if you have a payroll, then you can apply, and that'll help cover the cost of your payroll. And I apologize, my phone is going off here. But that'll help cover the cost of your payroll. Obviously, a lot of our producers, a lot of our members do not have a payroll, and so therefore might not qualify. But if you do, you can put in an application. They'll give you those funds if you use it for payroll, and then I believe it's up to 75% of it could be used for other costs, such as mortgage, rent, and interest. If you use those funds, it can be forgiven up to 100%. The way that operates is they give you 2.5 months worth of payroll is what you're applying for. And when you apply for that, you have 8 weeks to spend that money. And if whatever you spend within that 8 weeks, in accordance with their guidelines, is forgiven. Now, a lot of people will say, well, it's not truly, there's no opportunity to be able to forgive 100% of that loan, so I'll have to pay some of that loan back because 8 weeks is less than 2.5 months. That is absolutely correct. But if you remember, I believe up to 25% of that can be used for other expenses that are outlined as part of that program. And so what folks are telling people to do is if you have a payroll, pay your payroll, but also make sure to utilize that for other things like the mortgage and the rent. And if you're able to do that, then they will forgive up to 100% of that loan. And so that's something that, again, just about everyone under the sun that has a payroll can apply for. And so there's that money, whenever they opened it up about 2 weeks ago or so, they depleted 100% of those funds. And so they actually passed a new bill last night. The House did final passage of it, which is going to put another $310 billion, I believe, into that program. And so it's fixing to get another shot in the arm. If you haven't applied for that and you think you would qualify, I would suggest that you do. Again, traditionally, agriculture folks could not qualify for that, but now that they do, they've allowed your farm credit banking system type banks to write those loans. And so you can go down to, Heritage or Capital Farm Credit or any of the land banks and get those loans from your regular banker. And so that's one. Another program is the EIDL program. That's also at the Small Business Administration. And this program is a grant. It's not a loan. It is a grant that you can qualify for up to $10,000 by going to the SBA and applying. And I believe you can do that through an online application. The problem with the original CARES Act is they did not, they said that agriculture could apply for whatever reason. The SBA did not interpret that to be cow-calf, stalker operators, feeders, anybody within the cattle industry. They said it applied to aquaculture. They said it applied to agriculture cooperatives, maybe one or two other entities, but not what we consider our membership base. And so that was very frustrating. A lot of people were going after that. There was a common saying that the only people who couldn't qualify for that money was strip joints, lobbyists, and agriculture, because quite frankly, those were the three segments that they were excluding. Everyone else pretty well could have access to it. Luckily, with the passing of the legislation yesterday afternoon, Congress clarified that agriculture could apply. And so as of, I presume today, as soon as the president signed it, we'll be able to go online and apply for that grant. Again, up to a $10,000 grant, no loan, and you can just take it and use it to get through this hard economic times. That's the stuff that's available today. As I mentioned, there is $9.5 billion earmarked in the CARES Act for specifically for those dairy cattle, beef cattle, and specialty crops. That money was sent to USDA, and as Dr. Benavides had mentioned earlier, they're still trying to write that program, figure out how to determine the damages, and they're, not to get too far in the weeds, but they're utilizing the market facilitation program at USDA so to help provide those direct payments, which beef cattle were not previously part of, and so they're having to write us into that program. That has not been finalized, but what has been finalized as of last Friday, a week ago, Secretary Sonny Perdue and President Trump made an announcement that there's going to be $19 billion available for direct payment to agricultural producers. And what they took is they took the money from the CARES Act and put it with some existing funds at USDA, and they created this overall program, which they call the CAFT, I believe, the coronavirus, or CFAP, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, CFAP. A lot of people are calling it, and I think Dr. Benavides mentioned that earlier as well. And that's that big chunk of money, of which we now feel pretty assured that $5.1 billion of that will go to beef cattle. So what does that mean? There will be direct payments available. They will go to beef cattle producers. Because it's utilizing that market facilitation program, the way you would apply would go to your local FSA office and apply through that means. Again, that's $5.1 billion for beef cattle. And in some reports that were produced, the estimated damages, and again, Justin could probably answer this better, but we're seeing estimated damages to the beef industry about $13 billion or more. So that's not enough to make everybody whole. So it's perceived that this is going to be very much a first come, first served type of a program. We feel like there will be additional money being put into that program at a later date. I know there's some stuff we're working on behind the scenes over at USDA and within Congress to help make sure that is happening. But, obviously it's not over as of this point. And so those are going to be direct payments and being made available. Again, we just don't know the timeline of all that yet because they haven't completed that part. And so that'll also be part of, some payments that producers can take advantage of. I don't know, Dr. Benavides, if there's anything you want to add to that segment before I go to the next part of the question.
No, that all sounds good. I want to clarify, Caleb. So you mentioned 9.5 twice, so it's not a total of 19 billion for cattle and dairy and specialty. It's 9.5 in total, right?
19 billion is the overall CAFT or CAFP package that USDA announced on Friday. We knew that $9.5 billion would be split up between those three ag sectors: dairy, specialty crops, and beef cattle. But now, as of a week ago, we know that 5.1 billion of that will be given to beef cattle producers. So if you erase the 19 and the 9.5, just focus, what we have available to us is that $5.1 billion. And so if there's not any more clarifications on that. I was going to try to address the other part of that question when it talks to the disparity of beef prices and live cattle prices and those wide margins that the packers are seeing, and kind of what is it, and that's something, quite frankly, that the person who asked that question is exactly right, has been present prior to COVID-19. I know in a lot of discussions I've had, a lot of you may have heard of the Holcomb Tyson plant fire that happened some time back. And a lot of people are saying, well, this was going on prior to that as well. And all those people are exactly right. But just to give you a little bit of background of kind of where TSCRA is and kind of what we're doing to help address that, I think that's something that all of our members are hyper aware of and something that we want to adequately address. And so, I mean, just this morning, I was on a 2-hour conference call with a new working group called the Live Cattle Market Working Group. It's under our Marketing and Transportation Committee within TSCRA. And it's a group of our members that are in all different parts of the industry, and they're working together to try to address, what is it that allows these packers to take advantage of these times, and what is it that contributes to those wide margins. A lot of that refers back to that futures prices and how that influences live cattle prices and how closely connected they are. And as Justin said, whenever you have a bunch of things happening globally in a pandemic such as this, there's a lot of things moving around, investors and speculators jumping in, jumping out. And so that's really created a lot of volatility in the market. And so they're looking at that, and also looking, quite frankly, a lot of market practices, and not to get too far in the weeds into some of this, but for instance, there's a 2-hour window at the CME before the market opens where people can put in long and short orders and do some different things in the 2 hours prior to the market actually opening. And they say that they need that there for some of the market makers, they call them, to figure out and certify a couple of things, and they put some contracts in and make some orders. However, we've noticed, especially on the pork side, actually, in the past month or so, that there's a whole lot of very odd and suspicious activity happening in that 2-hour window of time before markets open. And what has the potential of happening is a lot of these traders, they're using algorithms to operate kind of high frequency trading quickly on down to the nanosecond. And those algorithms will take all that activity into account. And with that, it influences them to do different things within the market. And a lot of people suspect that's also increased market volatility. And quite frankly, when you look at packers, they're procuring a large percentage of their cattle based off those futures contracts. And because of that, you see some of those wide margins. And so we have a group put together, again, of cow-calf operators, stocker operators, some folks that contract cattle, people that only operate on a cash basis, and they're all working together to try to figure out the best way to address some of this. And some of them have actually already had some meetings with some of the folks at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange on some of these issues, especially as it relates to the high frequency trading and the speculations and some of the things that are happening before the markets open. But with that, I'll stop. And if I didn't fully answer your question, please let me know.
Caleb, thank you so much for jumping on the. I texted him and said, "Hey, can you can you help us out real quick?" So, Caleb, thank you for doing that. Dr. Benavides, we've reached our hour, so I just wanted to say thank you for your help and doing this program for us today. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that we can have you back with Cattle Raisers again. Certainly, we're happy to have you on today. And again, thank you all for being on our call. And again, we'll send the recording out tomorrow. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to let Cattle Raisers know. We're still working for you on your behalf, and hope that we can help you through anything. that you need during this time, and continue to bring you good information. But if you have ideas on something that we could be bringing you, certainly love to hear those as well. So again, thank you, and have a great rest of your Friday afternoon.